We began this semester with a seemingly simple question. How do you know what you know? This set the foundation for our explorations of epistemology, and we have delved deeply into how scientists distinguish between justified belief and mere opinion. You've spent most of the semester probing the limits of scientific understanding about some topic that you chose, and hopefully by now you have a much better sense of how science generates new knowledge by first identifying specific gaps in our models of how the world works, gaps that can be filled in through focused empirical study. We've also talked a lot this semester about the differences between primary and secondary literature, emphasizing that journal articles do most of the heavy work of communicating science between scientists. That's a lot to take in, so it wouldn't be at all surprising to learn that most of you probably haven't given a lot of conscious thought to how all those scientific papers get published in the first place. It may seem like a trivial question, hardly worth your time, but unless you understand the process by which scientists go from identifying a gap in our understanding to publishing the results of a study to fill in that gap, you won't fully appreciate just why journal articles hold pride of place in the scientific community. It's also essential for you to know at least the fundamentals of this process if you want to fully understand the scientific process. There is a lot more to the scientific method than the scientific method that's usually presented in textbooks would lead you to believe. In this video, then, I want to take you through that process of how a scientific study becomes a paper. What's the first step in turning a research project into a journal article? Whenever I ask this question, the most common answer people provide is something along the lines of, write the paper. That's not a bad answer, really, but it begs the question, what are you going to write? Why, the results of the research, most people reply. Great. So really, the first step isn't to write the paper, it's to do the research. Apply whatever methodology you need, gather, analyze the data, reach your conclusions, then you can begin writing your paper. Wait a minute. If you've ever worked in a research lab, and it really doesn't matter what the lab was studying, at some point you were probably shocked by one outstanding reality. Science is expensive. We're talking really expensive. To carry out most research studies, you've got to pay researchers' salaries along with their benefits. You've got to pay for reagents, you've got to pay for supplies. Scientific equipment is astronomically expensive, not only to purchase but to maintain. And then there are just the expenses of maintaining the lab space itself. You've got electricity, water, waste disposal, safety equipment, cleaning the space, etc. There's just so much there. If you want to carry out that research, then you're going to need some big bucks. Where's that money going to come from? The answer, of course, is that most research is paid for by funding institutions. These may be federal agencies like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the National Science Foundation, or the Department of Defense. Or they may be private foundations such as the American Diabetes Association or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. As you can probably imagine, these institutions have large piles of money earmarked for research. However, they don't have endless supplies of money, and they tend to be extremely selective in how they distribute those funds. Before you can carry out your research project, then, you generally have to secure a grant from one or more of these organizations. The first step in turning a scientific study into a journal article, then, really begins with a grant proposal. Now, going into all the ins and outs of the grant process would open up a huge can of worms. Suffice it to say that every single granting agency is unique, each with its own funding mandates, deadlines, application processes, etc. Even so, there are some things most of them have in common. Once you've identified a funding agency that seems like a good match for your research questions, you need to submit a detailed proposal that identifies what the research is going to be about and why it's important, that summarizes what the scientific community currently understands about the topic, details what aspects of the topic are still unclear, what gaps in our understanding remains. If that sounds familiar, that's because it's what you've been doing all semester with your literature reviews. The only way to build new knowledge in science is to accurately define the limits of our understanding. What we've been working on for your capstone project is a light version of what is at the very heart of scientific epistemology. Of course, a grant proposal will also include other important information too. In particular, it needs to outline a specific research plan for addressing the research questions, often including detailed methodology and experimental design. It needs to estimate how much time and money will be needed to carry out the research, and it's going to provide the credentials of the people responsible for supervising that research. Whatever the specifics of each institution may be, almost every grant proposal must then be reviewed by a committee of scientists with the necessary expertise to understand the proposal and evaluate its merits in terms of importance, feasibility, likelihood of success, expense, relevance to the institution's funding mandates, etc. Because there are a lot of research scientists out there and research is so extremely expensive, it shouldn't come as a surprise that every committee has to evaluate far more grant proposals than they could possibly ever fund. Usually then, what they'll do is rank the proposals in an order that reflects which proposals they think should be prioritized for funding. The institution will then decide how many of those grants will receive awards based on the recommendations of the committee and the amount of money that they have available during that particular funding cycle. So, what are your chances of getting a grant so that you can do your research? Not great, as it turns out. Each agency is different, of course, and funding levels shift every single cycle. However, from someplace like the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health, your chances are only around 10%. Given what's riding on securing those funds, writing grants is a high-stakes, high-pressure game. Remember, it's not just you who is affected by the outcome of that grant proposal. If it were, that would be stressful enough. It's also all the researchers in your lab, not to mention the people who might be helped by your research. What do you do then when, not if, your proposal gets rejected? Well, first, and this is most important, you cry. You may then try to drown your sorrows in some stiff drinks. Eventually, though, you have to regroup and to decide what to do next. One option, of course, is simply give up on the project idea. That sounds defeatist, but sometimes you really have to cut your losses and accept that the project, for whatever reason, may just not be fundable in the current environment. Your time would be better spent working on other ideas. Most often, though, you'll triage what might have gone wrong, reassess your approach, and revise your proposal, either to submit to the same agency in the next funding cycle, or another agency where you think you might have a better chance. Okay, let's assume you write the grant, you get the funding, and just as remarkably, the research all goes smoothly, generating valuable data that allows you to answer the research questions that started this process in the first place. Lucky you! Now you finally get to write that manuscript. Well, not quite. Before you do, you should spend some time carefully considering just which of the thousands of journals out there you want to submit to. There's a lot to consider in that decision, far more than I can squeeze into a single video. However, some of the things you'll want to think about are which journals are the best match for your research questions and approach. Of those, which journals are more prestigious in the field than others? Which ones are most likely to accept your manuscript? Do any of them offer open access options? Thinking through questions like these first is important because writing is far more effective and easier when you have a target audience in mind. For instance, if you're writing to a highly specialized journal, you can probably skip a lot of the background material that you might have to include if you're writing to a more generalized journal. Of course, another reason to consider where you want to publish is so you know which citation style to use and how to properly format your manuscript for submission. Setting up those expectations early is usually easier than reformatting everything at the end. So, you select your journal, and now you can finally write that manuscript. At this point, your manuscript is considered in preparation. Chances are good that you're writing this with other authors, so there's likely a lot of back and forth between everyone as you go along. You may also solicit informal review from colleagues and peers to improve your chances of success. Depending on the nature of your research and who your co-authors are, that finished manuscript can take months to write. Eventually, though, you'll have something that you can submit to your journal of choice. At that point, your manuscript is considered under review. But what actually happens next? Well, the first person who will see your manuscript of the journal is an editor. Editors have many roles to play in the publication process. The first thing they will do, though, is a quick assessment of your manuscript to see if it's a match to the journal's mission and probably to get a rough estimate of the quality of the work. Based on this preliminary decision, the editor may decide to reject your paper immediately. This is known as an editorial rejection. Yes, it's discouraging, it's frustrating. However, at least you have a quick answer, which, as we'll see here in a moment, can't be said of other stages in the process. If you get an editorial rejection, what do? Well, you cry, of course, and possibly even throw a tantrum, probably followed by a few stiff drinks. Eventually, though, you need to regroup and to decide what to do next. One option is to give up and move on to the next project. Sound familiar? Yeah, you have to make these sort of decisions all the time as a scientist. Sometimes you know going in that the manuscript isn't as strong as it should be, and that it has little chance of publication even in a low prestige journal. In those cases, it's best to just cut your losses. Most often, though, you'll take whatever comments the editor may have provided, though they aren't likely to have given much, if any feedback. You'll triage what might have gone wrong, possibly bolster your research, revise your manuscript, and try to submit it to a different journal. If you've ever been through this process, you'll have an even greater appreciation for reference management software. It's so much easier than trying to manually change all of your citations to a new journal's style. Now, if the editor thinks your paper is a good match for their journal and that it merits consideration, they'll then send it out for peer review. Each journal is different, but most journals will probably send your manuscript to anywhere from 3 to 5 scientists to review. Some may even be less, some may be even more, but most are going to be between 3 and 5 scientists. These will be scholars who have the expertise to evaluate your experimental design, data analysis, and conclusions. As a rule, most journals try to make this a double-blind process, with neither the author nor the reviewers knowing each other's identities. In practice, authors and reviewers often give themselves away unintentionally. Plus, if you're in a highly specialized field, everyone knows what everyone else is working on, so it's often impossible to have true anonymity. Contrary to common misconceptions, peer reviewers do not repeat all of your experiments. That would be incredibly time-consuming and expensive. Often it might not even be possible. Rather, each reviewer reads the manuscript to assess the validity and importance of the research questions, the appropriateness of the methods used, the quality of the data and the data analysis, and the validity of the conclusions. Note that while reviewers may comment on the quality of the writing, they often don't. Even when they do, it's usually not the primary thing they focus on, which helps explain why scientific literature is often so badly written. After reading your paper, each reviewer returns your manuscript along with their detailed comments to the editor with one of 3 recommendations: reject, revise and resubmit, or accept. The editor then considers all of the assessments and returns their verdict to you. It's not uncommon to have to wait months to get the editor's decision. For especially groundbreaking and important work, the editor may expedite the process, but most often they won't. If the editor decides to reject your manuscript after peer review, they'll nevertheless send the reviewer's comments to you. At that point, you have to decide what to do. I mean, after crying, of course, throwing your tantrum and having a few drinks. Again, you may decide, based on the reviewer's feedback, that it would take too much work to address them all and that your time is better spent on other projects. Most often, though, you'll work to address the criticism. This may entail doing more research, and it will certainly involve revising your manuscript before submitting it to a different journal, at which point the entire editorial process starts all over again. The most common decision editors make is revise and resubmit. It's rare for a journal to accept a paper as is. As an author, this is annoying because it means there were significant criticisms raised by one or more of your reviewers that need to be addressed before the editor will accept your paper for publication. This too may evoke some tears, tantrums, and cocktails. However, it's actually a pretty encouraging outcome because it amounts to a provisional acceptance of your work. Yes, it means more labor on your part, but at least there's hope of getting your paper in print at the end of it all. Once again, the editor will send you all of the reviewer's comments so you can respond to them. You don't actually have to change every single thing the reviewers recommend. However, you do have to explain why you didn't when you resubmit your revised manuscript. When you resubmit, what happens next depends on the journal. Some journals send it back to the reviewers to get their opinions on the changes you made, which can take forever. Thankfully, most journals don't do that. Instead, the editor reads your revised manuscript and decides whether you've adequately addressed the reviewer's criticisms. If you haven't, then the editor will send you a rejection notice. If you have, though, they will send you a notice that your manuscript has been accepted. When you get that acceptance, it's the most extraordinary feeling in the world. You may still shed a few tears, but this time of happiness, and you may celebrate with some adult beverages. You've earned them. However, your work isn't done just yet. Yes, your manuscript is now considered accepted, but now it goes on to the next stage of the process, which is it moves to the copy editor. This person's job is to carefully edit your paper for grammar and style issues. They'll also check each of your citations and bibliographic entries for proper formatting. And finally, they'll take care of all the page layout. Once completed, the copy editor will send you what are called galley proofs of your paper. These are the pages as they will appear when the article finally goes to print. The copy editor will also send you a list of issues that need to be addressed. They may, for instance, ask you to check punctuation and wording changes to make sure the meaning wasn't affected. They may also ask you for missing bibliographic information. They may ask you to produce clearer images, figures, tables, etc. There may be some back and forth through this process. Once it's completed, though, your part in the process is finally done. It may be a while before your article gets into print. These days, many, if not most journals, will publish your article online before they put it into print. Indeed, I've had articles that didn't make it into print until 2 years after they made it online. It doesn't matter though, it's still a fantastic feeling. So there you have it. It's a simple, straightforward process by which a research question ultimately becomes a journal article. Straightforward, right? The time between initial concept, asking those initial questions, to final production can take years, and as you can see, it's a lot of work. It's completely worth it though. Now, undoubtedly, at some point in your research this semester, you came across a paywall to access an article. Most often, journals charge somewhere around $25 to $30 to access a single journal article, but they can be much, much higher. Thankfully, university libraries pay for their members to have access, so you didn't have to think about it much as you were researching your topics. However, given how expensive it is for people outside the university to access journal articles, how much do you suppose authors make for their efforts? Clearly, this is a lot of work, so it must pay, right? So what do you think would be a reasonable amount for all that effort given how much the journal charges? $50? $500? $5,000? The real amount may surprise you. Authors make absolutely no money for publishing in scientific journals. In fact, they often have to pay what are called page charges to get their study into print, sometimes to the tune of several $1,000s. So where does all that money go? Is it going to the editors? Not really. Some prestigious journals will have full-time editors that draw a salary, but most journal editors are active researchers who do the work as part of their professional service. It looks great on a CV, and it affords some wonderful networking opportunities. But it doesn't pay much, if anything. About the most an editor can expect is to get some small stipend to pay for an administrative assistant to take care of all of the correspondence. Okay, if not the editors, is the money going to the peer reviewers? Nope. Peer review is seen as a professional responsibility. It can take hours to review a single paper, time that takes away from other obligations you might have. But it's so integral to the process that most scholars see it as an important duty in the service of science. About the only person in this whole convoluted chain who is likely to see a salary is the copy editor. Copy editing can be a decent living, but not enough to account for paywall prices. So where does all that money go? Most of it to the journal publisher. There may be thousands of journals, but there are only a handful of publishers, and they have some of the highest profit margins in any industry. Some estimates put their profit margin at around 40%. Why in the world, then, would scientists put themselves through all of this just to line the pockets of publishing companies? Well, for one, they may not get paid directly for their publications, but publications are how scientists measure success. The more journal articles you have published, the more successful you'll be in seeking tenure and promotion at universities, and the more likely you'll be able to secure grants for future projects. For another thing, the journal article is the heartbeat of scientific epistemology. As we've discussed before, scientists place the greatest trust in the information published in journal articles, and they need reliable information in order to further the scientific enterprise. This motivates them to contribute their time to the process, even though they don't see any direct monetary gain for their time and effort. Hopefully, after seeing how this whole process works, you can understand why scientists place such trust in journal articles. Consider how many points in the process a scientist's work is put under scrutiny by other competent scientists, starting with the initial grant proposal, continuing through the writing process, and finishing with the final review each paper undergoes before being accepted. Now, publication in a scientific journal does not guarantee accuracy, and it certainly doesn't guarantee truth. Science and scientists often get things wrong. Rather, publication is a kind of quality control that certifies the information has been through the scientific process. A journal article isn't just some blog entry that someone threw together. It isn't some sensational idea that a research group threw together as clickbait for advertising revenue. A journal article reflects a long, deliberate process with checks and balances all along the way to ensure the information represents the best scientific understanding possible at the time it's published. Better scientific understandings will very likely come along to displace the current article's pride of place. But that's not a failing of the system, it's a feature. Each article represents a tiny step forward. Put enough of those tiny steps together, though, and science can take us far, very far. I hope you find this overview of the publication process helpful. As always, remember, be gentle with yourselves and kind to one another. Thanks for watching.